In this week's story, some students discover caves below their cellar, but the caves hold some dark and disturbing secrets. It took me a long time to piece together what happened to the students involved in the notorious Nottingham cave incident. It's a story that few want told, and fewer still can actually believe. Most people find it convenient to dismiss the horrors that lurk down there in the dark, waiting for human flesh upon which to prey. First, a little context. The town of Nottingham in England is best known for the legend of Robin Hood, who supposedly lived in the nearby Sherwood Forest and was pursued by the Sheriff of Nottingham. However, there is a curious fact about Nottingham that is poorly known even among people who live there. Beneath the town lies many elaborate cave systems, consisting of perhaps a greater number of caves than lie beneath any other town of comparable size in the world. The caves are not natural, at least not the ones we know of. They were all carved by hand over the centuries out of the soft sandstone bedrock. More than 800 caves have been discovered, according to official figures, some dating to the 13th century. The 13th century, needless to say, was a very different time to the present. Europe was scoured by malaria, leprosy, tuberculosis, and other hideous diseases. Germ theory still lay in the distant future, and many people in the city lived in poverty-stricken, primitive conditions. By then, Nottingham was already hundreds of years old, and Nottingham Castle had already existed for nearly 2 centuries. Nottingham already had a church, St. Peter's, which still exists today, and a pub, Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem, which also still exists. The old medieval city was entirely surrounded by Sherwood Forest. Were time travel feasible, only a person brave and foolish in equal measure would dare to travel back to such a time. When the 4 students moved into the old house in Cliff Road in 1993, they must have congratulated themselves on finding accommodation in such a central location at such a reasonable price. Bradley Rowling was studying management at the university. Stephen Manning and Nushka Price were studying graphic design, and Elizabeth Blackwood, known to her friends as Ellie, was studying history. The 4 of them had met a year earlier, after all 4 had joined a student society devoted to hiking. The circumstances under which Ellie first met Nushka were later recalled by several other members of the hiking group. A dozen or so students had set off for a hike through Cresswell Crags, a local beauty spot where human remains dating to 50,000 years ago have been discovered. The group hadn't yet left the town when Ellie had stopped to pet a loud and seemingly ferocious dog whose owner had left it tied to a railing outside a shop. "Do you know that dog?" Nushka had said, surprised. "No," Ellie had said. "Aren't you scared of him?" "No," said Ellie. "He just wants attention. Look at him. He's a softie." It was a curious aspect of Ellie's character, judged by her peers to be, in general, rather anxious and neurotic, that she had absolutely no fear of dogs, and dogs seemed to respond to her in kind. Nushka was impressed. However, it appears that by the time of the tragic occurrences which we will shortly examine, relations between the 4 of them had somewhat soured, no doubt due to a rather uneven mixture of personalities. From the students themselves, we have only the account of the sole survivor of the events that occurred in the first half of 1994, but together with information supplied by their friends and acquaintances, and the official reports that I have been able to obtain by distinctly unofficial routes, we may form a fairly accurate picture of the disaster that befell them. The whole thing began when they decided to pool their money and buy a sack of potatoes for the sake of economy. They dragged the sack down to the cellar to keep it cool, and it was Nushka who first noticed the smell. "It stinks down here," she said. "Smells like someone's died," said Bradley. "Probably a dead animal," said Stephen. "I don't think we should be down here," said Ellie. It's just a bad smell, said Bradley. What if it gets into the potatoes, said Ellie. That can't happen, said Stephen. Stop worrying. In the end, it was Stephen who decided to investigate further. We can pin the date down precisely, thanks to Ellie's diary. It was a cool but sunny morning in May of 1994, and Ellie was trying to study in her room. She couldn't concentrate because of Bradley's music, which was both loud and not to her taste. She knocked on his half-open door. Could you turn it down a bit? She said. I can't concentrate. This is an amazing track, said Bradley. Maybe you should chill out a bit. I don't want to chill out, said Ellie. I want to pass my exams. Half an hour, okay? Said Bradley. I'm going out in a bit. She sighed in frustration and went downstairs to the kitchen. In the kitchen, the house's entire stock of plates, pots, pans and cutlery was stacked up in and around the sink, making it essentially impossible to eat, or at least to cook. The previous day she had faced the same situation and had washed everything, hoping to inspire her housemates to keep the place cleaner, but clearly it hadn't worked. She began to systematically clean well-defined areas so that she could make herself some lunch, washing some items and stacking up others. It was while she was engaged in this that Stephen suddenly arrived, covered in dust and mud, took a dirty mug and filled it up with cold water. I'm thirsty, he said, by way of explanation. What happened to you? Said Ellie. What do you mean? Said Stephen. You're covered in filth. Oh yeah, right. I went down to the cellar to try to find out what's making this smell, and you know what? There are holes in the floor. If you put your ear to the holes, you can hear, weird noises. What kind of weird noises? Hard to describe, like some animal. Anyway, I started, trying to enlarge the holes to find out where they go, but it's weird. The cellar floor just, crumbles when you hit it with something hard, like the big kitchen knife. You're using the kitchen knife to enlarge rat holes, Stephen. Yeah, basically, said Stephen. Anyway, catch you later. Stephen trundled off back down the cellar steps. In the evening of the same day, Ellie, Nushka and Bradley were watching TV in the small but serviceable living room when Stephen appeared. He looked much the same as he had at lunchtime, Ellie noted, but worse. His hair, clothes and face were caked in a kind of light sandy mud. He was holding a filthy chopping knife. Nushka jumped when she saw him. Bloody hell, she shrieked. Everyone, I've an announcement to make, said Stephen, waving the knife. Let me guess, said Bradley. You've decided you're John Rambo. I've been digging in the cellar, yeah? Said Stephen, ignoring him. And I've broken through into some kind of tunnel. It's massive. There's old stuff in it, like pottery and candles. Stephen explained that by enlarging rat holes in the sandy stone upon which the house rested, he had eventually dug his way into what appeared to be an ancient artificial cave. The four students made their way to the cellar, where Stephen had created a surprisingly substantial sloping hole in the cellar floor, using only the knife, together with a mop bucket for removing bits of sand and rock. He insisted the hole could be safely navigated, and Bradley entered the hole to see for himself. Then, when he returned safely, Nushka too decided to investigate. Only Ellie refused to enter the hole, arguing it probably wasn't safe. Certainly the stomach-churning fetid smell argued against the air being entirely safe to breathe. It's totally amazing, said Bradley. It's like some kind of medieval thing. There's like a painting on the wall and stuff, said Nushka. Did you see it? Yeah, and like old parchments. Totally incredible. In the day following the discovery, the four of them argued among themselves about what best to do. Ellie felt the history department should be informed, since the professors would undoubtedly know what ought to be done in such a situation, but Bradley argued vociferously in favour of keeping the discovery to themselves. We found it, we're renting the house, so it's ours, he said. They had been hampered in their investigations by the lack of proper lighting. At first they relied on cigarette lighters to light up the tunnel, but they quickly decided to invest in strong electric torches. Ellie reluctantly agreed to keep the discovery a secret while they carried out a survey. Over the next few weeks, Bradley, and Stephen in particular, often accompanied by Nushka, made extensive surveys of the system of tunnels without ever reaching the end of it. It seemed to go on forever, and had an appearance of having lain undiscovered since medieval times. Their living room became a museum of medieval artefacts, the like of which any museum would have envied. The house across the road was rented by another group of students with whom Stephen was very friendly, and although he probably didn't let them in on the secret, he did make numerous visits to their house during this period of time. It was there that the sickness first emerged. A girl by the name of Tara Reynolds became seriously ill with an illness that baffled her doctors. 2 other members of that household soon fell ill with similar symptoms, and then Stephen himself became ill. Nushka and Ellie were sitting in the kitchen drinking tea when Bradley entered, having just gone to check on Stephen's current condition. "He's feeling a bit better," he said. "He told me something a bit alarming though. You know, when he was down in the caves a few days ago, he said something bit him. He showed me the bite on his arm. It looks a bit messed up." Nushka and Ellie exchanged alarmed glances. "He needs to see a doctor," said Ellie. "What for? He's getting better," said Bradley. "Yeah, it's better if we keep this quiet," said Nushka. "I'm already in enough trouble as it is." Nushka happened to have endured a police visit only 2 months previously, after she had passed an illicit substance to another student who had ended up freaking out, as she put it, and seeking medical attention. She had hung on to her position as a student at the university only by vigorously denying everything. "What if he doesn't get better?" said Ellie. "What if he's passed it on to Tara? The doctor needs to know about it." "Brad said he's getting better," said Nushka. "So he's getting better. Tara will get better as well." "You don't know that," said Ellie. "Look, I took GCSE biology," said Nushka. "I know more about medical stuff than you do." "Yeah, but you failed it," said Ellie. "Girls, can we calm it down a bit?" said Bradley. "If we all pull together, we can get through this." "She's never respected me," said Nushka to Bradley, as though Ellie were not present with them. "Just because of my nose ring." "It's nothing to do with your nose ring," said Ellie. "Everything is not about your facial piercings." "Let's not do this now, yeah?" said Bradley. But the argument continued to escalate, and while most of the details have been lost to scholarship, it appears that Nushka and Ellie were barely on speaking terms by the end of it. 3 days passed by and Stephen was able to get out of bed and was clearly almost fully recovered. At this point he decided to visit Tara, and when he returned, he was apparently rather pale. "She's been taken to hospital," he told the other 3. "The other 2 might have to go into hospital as well." "Are you going to go and see her?" said Bradley. Ellie's diary records that Stephen seemed almost in a state of shock, and she wondered at the time if he had really told them everything. "Yeah," said Stephen. "I suppose I'd better." Stephen went to the hospital the next day, and the news he brought back wasn't good. He hadn't been able to see Tara. She was in intensive care. However, he had spoken to her parents, and they had informed him that Tara was covered in hideous purple-red blotches and was bleeding from her eyes, ears and mouth. The doctors were completely mystified. There was some suggestion that Tara might have contracted an infectious disease, but no disease with her exact symptoms was known to exist. The following day, Ellie heard some commotion in the living room, and when she went to find out what was going on, she found Nushka almost crying, Stephen pale and shaking, and Bradley attempting to maintain order. "What's happening?" said Ellie. "Tara's dead," said Bradley. "Her flatmates have been taken to hospital." "What, all 4 of them?" said Ellie. "Yeah, all 4 of them," said Bradley. "What are we going to do?" wailed Nushka. "We don't know that they caught it from Stephen," said Bradley. "It could be anything. They might have eaten something rotten." "Look at his arm," shouted Nushka, and she pulled up Stephen's t-shirt to reveal an ugly purple and green bite mark. "It's getting worse. I don't know what it is, but it came from the caves." "Well, why aren't we all ill?" said Bradley. "Perhaps you are," said Stephen quietly. "You don't know how long it takes to develop." "Bloody hysterical nonsense," said Bradley. "We need to tell the doctors at the hospital," said Ellie. "I'm going to tell them." She made to leave the room, but Bradley blocked her way. "You're not telling them anything," he said. "We need to discuss this together. I say we don't tell them." "Nushka?" "I can't afford to get chucked out," she said. "If you tell them, you have to say I had nothing to do with it." "Stephen," said Bradley. "No," said Stephen. "No way. They'll blame me. We need to keep this to ourselves." "That's 3 against 1, said Bradley. "We've made a communal decision not to tell anyone." "It's not 3 against 1, said Ellie. "It's—" But she cut herself off mid-sentence. Something outside the window had caught her attention. The house's living room was on the 2nd floor and had previously been a master bedroom. From the window it was possible to see quite a long way down the street. "What?" said Nushka. "Something's happening at the end of the street," said Ellie. They gathered to look out of the window. About a dozen people were walking about in white biohazard suits, complete with respirators, cordoning off the street. Several military vehicles were parked behind the cordon, soldiers with rifles standing around chatting. "Their ceiling is in," said Stephen. "They're not going to let us leave." "Looks like Tara got some messed up medieval disease then," said Bradley. "You don't know that," said Stephen. "It's the most likely option," said Bradley. "Then why aren't we all dead?" said Stephen. Nushka's reply to this question implied a certain level of intimacy between Stephen and Tara. It should be further noted that diseases passed from animals to humans sometimes become more virulent during the initial stages of passing them from human to human, as the disease adapts to the human organism. The 4 students watched events unfold from the window over the following hours. All traffic on the road ceased, and it was clear that both ends must be sealed off. The men in white biohazard suits began to go door to door, taking the occupants off somewhere. After each visit, armed police scoured the houses. Not until after darkness had fallen did they hear the gunshot. "Oh my God, what was that?" said Nushka. "Just a car backfiring," said Bradley. Stephen seemed to be brooding over something. "It sounded like a gun," he said. "It couldn't have been a gun," said Ellie. They peered through the windows trying to determine what was happening. The police and biohazard suit people had been working their way down the street, steadily approaching the house where the 4 of them lived. They watched in horror as a body was carried by the men wearing biohazard suits down the street and into an alley that led to a car park. "I know him," said Bradley. "His name's Andy." "He's bleeding," said Nushka in a hushed whisper. Andy appeared to have a bullet hole in his temple. "We can see the car park from my window," said Stephen. They rushed into Stephen's room and their eyes were met with an unfolding nightmare. First, Andy's body was thrown into a skip. Then, one by one, people from the surrounding houses were brought into the little, high-walled car park by the suited people. They were injected with something, following which they fell to the ground. Then their bodies were flung into a skip, the men swinging them backwards and forwards till they could gain enough momentum to clear the sides of the skip. Nushka began to scream. "They're killing them," she wailed. "Shut up," shouted Bradley. "You'll attract attention." But she continued to scream until he placed his hand over her mouth. "We need to get out of here, okay?" he said. "You need to be calm." She nodded, her eyes wide and frightened. "This isn't happening," said Ellie. "This can't be happening." "It's happening," said Bradley. "This is your fault." "How is it my fault?" said Ellie plaintively. "It was your idea to buy the potatoes," said Bradley. "There's only one way out of here," said Stephen quietly. "I'm not going back in the caves," said Nushka. "He's right," said Bradley. "We've no choice." They watched as another person was brought into the car park, injected, and thrown into the skip, apparently lifeless. "I think it's time to go," said Stephen. "Nush, you can come with us or you can stay here and die." "I'm coming," said Nushka. "Ellie," said Stephen. "Me too," said Ellie. They collected electric torches and lowered themselves through the hole Stephen had made in the cellar floor. It was the first time Ellie had been down there, but the others were used to it. For almost an hour they wandered up and down the passages, seeking a way out. Eventually they emerged into a small chamber containing a number of shelves filled with various objects, a sturdy metal door barring their way. "Take a look at this," said Bradley, shining his torch around. The shelves were stacked with old parchments, metal goblets covered in dust, and numerous items of what may once have been food, but were now overtaken by mould. Spotting an ancient-looking book on one of the shelves, Bradley removed it and placed it on the floor so he could open it. "I bet this stuff's valuable," said Nushka. "We should take some of it home with us." Bradley was silent, turning the pages. On one page was an illustration of a man covered in purple-red blotches, various parts of the man labelled in an unreadable ancient script. His face was contorted in apparent agony. "It's a medical text," said Bradley. "This is the disease Stephen got. Look." He turned the pages one by one. They were filled with vivid descriptions of the disease, illustrations of boils and gangrenous limbs, sightless putrid eyeballs, swollen purulent genitalia. "I think I'm going to be sick," said Ellie. The next page illustrated a bat biting an arm, its face evil and demonic. "We've got to get out of here," said Stephen. Bradley rose to his feet and began to try to open the metal door. Ellie placed a hand on his arm. "What if it's a warning?" she said. "What if it's telling us this is what will happen if we go through that door?" They looked at each other nervously in the torchlight. "She's got a point," said Nushka. "Steve-o, what do you think?" said Bradley. Stephen didn't reply. His eyes had become oddly fixed. Abruptly, he began to vomit blood. The other three leapt back in horror. The next few minutes dissolved into chaos as Bradley, Ellie and Nushka shouted frightened advice at each other and Stephen. But eventually Stephen crumpled to the ground where he remained, not moving. Bradley prodded him. "Steve-o," he shouted. "Stephen!" But Stephen didn't move. "Probably best not to touch him," said Ellie. Nushka swooped down on the buck before the blood Stephen had vomited, which had formed an expanding puddle, reached it. She pointed to an illustration of the medieval man sitting and eating. "It's all here, look," she said. "He gets bitten by the bat, he gets ill, then he seems to recover." Then she turned the page. "Then he vomits blood, and he dies." The final picture showed the man in a pool of blood or vomit, staring eyes indicating death. She took the book in her hands and held up the illustration, comparing it to Stephen. "Snap," said Bradley. "Listen," said Ellie, her voice shaking. "What's behind that door can't be any worse than what's on this side of it. If we can get out, I can call my father. He lives in France, he has a boat. If we can get to the south coast, he can pick us up, get us out of the country. It's our best chance." "Yeah, that's just great," said Nushka sarcastically. "I'm sure they just put this massive door here for no reason." Bradley swept his hair back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We could go back the way we came, explore the tunnels further," he said. "There's no way out back there," said Ellie. "We would have found it by now." They were deliberating the matter when a new and disturbing sound reached their ears, the yapping of dogs. They froze. Listening intently, they could hear the voices of men and footsteps. "They're coming for us," said Bradley. "They've found the tunnel. They're searching for us. We need to get through this door, now." He attacked the door, trying to find a way to open it. After some minutes of effort, he succeeded in opening it a couple of inches. The door was heavily rusted. Ellie and Nushka began to try to help him prise it open. The sound of the men and the dogs was growing. They couldn't be far away. "It's enough," said Bradley. "We can squeeze through this. Who's first?" He looked at the girls. "Okay, I'll go," he said, and he pushed himself slowly through the gap. Nushka followed, then Ellie. "We can lock this thing," said Bradley, shining a light on the other side of the door. A large metal bar could clearly be swung into a latch, making the door impossible to open from the other side without serious equipment. They pushed against the door until it shut again, bolted it, and stood panting in the near darkness. "Let's get out of here," said Nushka finally, and they began to make their way through the ancient tunnel. The tunnel seemed to lead slowly downwards, as though they were gradually progressing into the bowels of the earth. In places, the sides of the tunnel grew more uneven, resembling natural cave more than anything artificial, and strange fungal shapes clung to the walls. The air was thick with the stench of decomposition, and here and there, water ran down the walls. Many experts have since opined that probably the tunnels at that depth are suffused by sewage leaking from the sewers above, some of which have existed since medieval times. The sewage fed the growth of fungi, which formed the base of the nightmarish food chain that existed in the deepest of the caves. They were traipsing wearily down a long descending section of the tunnels, passing by many side branches that mostly appeared to go nowhere, when Ellie stopped. "What?" said Nushka. "Listen," said Ellie. From somewhere in front of them came the unmistakable sound of wolves howling. "It's the police dogs," said Bradley. "Police dogs don't howl like that," said Ellie. "What else can it be?" said Nushka. "Nothing good," said Bradley. No sooner had he spoken than a beast emerged from the darkness, padding silently and slowly towards them, like a cat stalking its prey. But this was no cat. It was a wolf or a large dog, with white, sightless eyes. "Oh my God!" screamed Nushka, and the beast launched itself at her throat. Ellie tried to pull it off her and succeeded in tearing it away, but Nushka's throat came with it. Ellie dropped the torch, picked up a rock and smashed it hard on the head, and it fell to the floor, jerking spasmodically. "Bradley!" she shouted. "Brad!" Brad was nowhere to be seen. She picked up the torch and it flickered and died. She tried shaking it in desperation, but it didn't help. Nushka's own torch had fallen and smashed when the animal had attacked her. Ellie was left in complete darkness. Sobbing with fear, she began to walk slowly in what she thought was the direction they had originally been heading in. Somewhere in the depths of the tunnels, an entire pack of dogs howled and snarled. For several minutes, she felt her way in the dark, trailing her fingers along the damp wall. A sudden, tremendous metallic banging somewhere in the distance behind her made her jump. Then she remembered the people who had been following them, police or army or whatever they were. No doubt they were trying to smash their way through the metal door. Eventually, to her enormous relief, she saw the light of Bradley's torch up ahead. She walked to it as briskly as she dared in the darkness, and there was Bradley. "You're alive," he said. "You left us," she said accusatorily. She was angry. "I thought the wolf had got you," he said. "I was alone in the dark," she said. "What can I say?" he said. "I'm sorry, yeah? I really thought that wolf had got both of you." "They're not wolves," she said. "They're feral dogs. God knows how long they've been down here. Maybe centuries. They're probably all blind." "Why would they be blind?" said Bradley. "Just because that one was doesn't mean they all are." From somewhere deep in the tunnels, the sound of howling continued. "If they're born down here, their eyes won't have developed normally," said Ellie. Bradley drew a deep breath while he pondered the matter. Then he said, "Well, we'd better get out of here." "Give me the torch," said Ellie. "Why?" said Bradley. "Because I can't trust you not to leave me again." "I won't leave you, okay? I thought you were dead, I swear." "Give me the torch." "No," he said. "Let's just go." There was no point arguing with him. They continued through the tunnels. "It's getting louder," said Bradley after a while. What? Said Ellie. The howling, said Bradley. Maybe we should go back. The police are behind us, said Ellie. I heard them banging at the door. It's only a matter of time till they break through it. Oh, bloody marvellous, said Bradley sarcastically. The floor of the tunnel began to grow more uneven, and it sloped gently upwards. We must be on the right track, said Ellie. We probably need to go about 100 feet upwards before we can get out. If we can get out, said Bradley. It makes no sense that there would be only one exit, said Ellie. If we're lucky, we'll emerge on the side of a hill or into a sewer. Never thought finding a sewer would be the highlight of my day. Then they heard a growling behind them. They wheeled around, and there was another blind dog, again resembling a wolf, but a dog nonetheless. Its teeth were bared, and its eyes were completely white. Run, said Bradley, and they began to run through the jagged, slowly ascending cave. After a pause, the dog began to follow them, snarling and barking, lolloping slowly and evenly, as though it chased humans through the cave on a daily basis and was used to the procedure. At one point, Bradley tripped over a stone, cracking his knee, and the torch went flying, and the dog almost caught up with them. Ellie grabbed his hand and pulled him to his feet, collected the torch, and they continued on their way, Bradley limping and crying about his leg. The torchlight was growing dimmer. The batteries wouldn't last much longer. They arrived at another chamber, this time without shelves. 3 tunnels led off in different directions. To the right, the tunnel seemed to slope fairly steeply upwards, while the others appeared level. They were about to run into the rightmost tunnel when the dogs appeared, 5 more of them, surrounding them. In all, 6 pairs of white, sightless eyes glared unseeing at them, 6 sets of teeth bared in hungry snarls. Stay calm, said Ellie. They're not hunters, at least not of humans. The biggest animal they ever see is probably a rat. One of them tore Nushka's throat out, said Bradley. Screw this. And he grabbed the torch and bolted for the right-hand tunnel. The dogs were on him in a second, tails wagging as they bit at his legs and arms, tearing his clothing. Play dead, shouted Ellie, frantically looking for stones to use as weapons. But in the gloom she could see almost nothing, the dim torchlight illuminating only Bradley trying to prise the dogs off him. Using the torch as a weapon, he struck hard at the head of one of the animals, and the light went out. The snarling turned into a fevered yapping, and Bradley cried out and then fell silent. Bradley, said Ellie quietly. There was no reply. She stepped slowly towards the last point where she had seen him. The dogs growled, and then, as if obeying an invisible master, they scattered and scampered off into the passageways. Bradley, she said. She was met by the sound of laboured breathing, but mixed with gurgling and spluttering sounds. She felt the darkness in front of her, and her fingers settled on Bradley's body. His clothes were wet and sticky, as though covered in blood. As she stood there, he took one last big gasp of air and fell silent. Oh God, Bradley, she cried. There was nothing she could do for him. He was gone. Steeling herself, she felt around for the torch and found it, or part of it. The batteries were missing, and the battery cover. Feeling around in the darkness, she located the missing parts and fitted them together with shaking hands, but no light came from the torch. She sat down heavily by the side of Bradley's corpse and began to cry convulsively. Then another sound reached her ears. More dogs, but this time mixed with the voices of men. Her pursuers had got through the metal door, and they were on her trail. She staggered to her feet, swaying in the darkness, and began to follow the tunnel upwards. She forced herself to move faster and faster, as the sound of the search dogs and the men grew louder, trailing one hand along the wall, the other hand probing the darkness in front of her. Finally, she was brought up sharp by a hard surface blocking her way. Although her hand contacted it first, she was nevertheless caught by surprise, and her face contacted the surface with some force. Blood emerged from her nose. She began to frantically feel out the surface, looking for some opening in it. Her hands settled on a round protuberance. It was unmistakably a doorknob. She turned it and pushed. By pushing hard, she was able to open it, and she stumbled, blinking and dazed, into a brightly lit room. The walls of the room were lined with showcases containing museum artifacts. A suit of medieval armour stood in the corner. A small crowd of people gawped at her in astonishment. A mother with 2 small children took hold of her children's hands and said, "Let's go." A Japanese man raised the camera slung around his neck and took a photo before a Japanese woman, perhaps his wife or girlfriend, said something in Japanese and dragged him out of the room. The other people still stood there, perhaps wondering whether to offer assistance or to flee the bizarre, filthy, bedraggled apparition that had materialized quite unexpectedly in front of them. Then an alarm sounded, and they too filed out briskly. Before she could focus her eyes properly and decide what to do, a gruff voice shouted, "Don't move." 3 policemen and 2 figures in biohazard suits filed into the room. "Looks like you are right," said one of the policemen to another. The 3rd policeman had a gun trained on her. They were dressed in black, as though ready to take down a gang of armed drug dealers. One of the figures in a biohazard suit approached her, handcuffs dangling from its hand. Ellie raised her hands in the air to show she was unarmed. So this is how it ends, she thought. Then the figure in the biohazard suit stopped, as if afraid of her. "Cuff her!" shouted the policeman holding the gun. Abruptly, he shifted the gun and fired a shot. Ellie jumped out of her skin, but she didn't die. The shot was not meant for her. Running out of the half-open door behind her, a pack of sightless dogs launched themselves at the policeman. A further shot seemed only to enrage the dogs, and she saw one of them tear at the gun holder's throat. The dogs were tearing open the biohazard suits, and she saw one of the suited figures fall and the dogs tear at its face before she walked off through the door. The dogs didn't follow her. The building was empty, everyone else having left when the alarm sounded. The path to the exit was well marked by large signs, and after ascending several flights of steps, she emerged from the front of Nottingham Castle into bright sunlight. As she walked, she wiped the blood from her nose with her sleeve. In 15 minutes, she was at the train station. Feeling in her pocket, she found a bank card and purchased a single ticket to Norwich. From there, she caught a train to London. Her clothes were ripped in places and somewhat filthy, but when she eventually stopped shaking and began to properly gather her thoughts, she freshened herself up as well as she could in the lavatory, and from the onboard caterer bought a bottle of water, a small bottle of Sauvignon Blanc served with a plastic glass, and a cheese sandwich. In London, she phoned her father from a public telephone box. When she heard his voice, she broke down in tears, but she managed to make him understand. Then she caught a train for Dover. When she arrived, it was dark. She checked into a hotel. That night she couldn't sleep. She paced back and forth in her room, anxiously scanning the road outside through the window. In the morning she forced herself to eat breakfast, and then she walked to the marina. The air was cool, and seagulls wheeled around above her head, calling to each other. Her heart pounded in her chest. Everything now depended on her father. In the distance a police siren sounded, then faded away again. She scanned the horizon anxiously, the sunlight glinting harshly off the calm sea. Then she saw it, a speck on the horizon, growing steadily larger, making its way inexorably towards her. As the boat drew closer, she saw a figure standing on it, and she waved. The figure waved back. She began to jump up and down, waving and shouting. Soon, the boat was close enough that she could recognize her father. He was smiling. Thank you for listening. My name's John and you've been listening to Science Horror. All the stories on this channel are written by me. If you enjoyed this story, please take up spelunking and necromancy immediately. That should help me with the YouTube algorithm. You could also consider clicking the like button and that would be great, but it's just not as effective as the dark arts. Thank you so much. Next week I have a story for you about a mad scientist who deliberately infects people with brain parasites. Do join me again for that. That should be out on Monday. Have a good week and until next time, sleep well.